flu is a disease that occurred from February 1918 all the way to April 1920. The Spanish flu is a contagious virus that attacks the respiratory system. Most of whom were affected were between the ages of 20 to 40 years old. Some may say their prime years. The Spanish flu likes to spread through respiratory droplets transmitted through the air. Symptoms included drowning in one's own blood, fluid in lungs, or the skin of the sick turning purple or blue. Due to just how contagious it was, it has killed around an estimated 50 to 100 million people and affected 500 million. Just in Canada alone, it killed 55,000 people. Keep in mind that in 1918, Canada's population was only 8 million, so that was around 6% of the total population that had died to this disease. And in the total world population, 3% died to this disease. In about 18 months, it had killed more people than AIDS did in 35 years, or the Black Plague in 100. The first wave, the Spanish flu came in multiple waves. The first wave hit in the spring of 1918, and the second wave hit the fall of the same year, as troops were coming home from the just-ended war. The second wave carried a mutation of the flu that produced a very deadly and contagious form of the disease. The second wave caused around 90% of the total deaths that happened during the pandemic. How did it reach Canada? Well, Quebec City, Montreal, and Halifax were some of the first places in Canada to welcome this newfound disease, which later spread to the west. Their soldiers returning from war had a major part in the spread of the disease. The returning soldiers that had no ill intent carried the disease all across Canada as they traveled east to west. The government authorities at the time attempted to stop the spread and save lives by prohibiting social gatherings and isolating those who were sick or showed symptoms. Despite their efforts, these attempts did truly little. Not long after the first case in Canada, Canada's economy was paralyzed. Canada had already suffered around 60,000 losses from the previous war and were experiencing many deaths with this newfound disease. These deaths significantly reduced the workforce, left a lot of families without a breadwinner, and orphaned thousands of children. The government was criticized deeply for doing so little, by not providing resources and coordination to public health authorities all over the country. Canadian citizens were angry. They felt as though the government were to blame for all the losses due to this disease. The government responded to this outrage by funding the Department of Health in 1919. Why was it called the Spanish flu? The deadly virus got its name, the Spanish flu, after the Spanish were the first to report on it. During the war, the Spanish had remained neutral. So why were they the first to report on it? Well, because they were neutral in the war, they had no consequences if they did report on it. While other countries were experiencing the same thing but felt as if they reported on it, then other countries would see their troops as weakened and not as good. And that's about it for my project.
Women's suffrage right is the right for women to vote in Canada's elections. The women running campaigns for these rights also demanded the right to run in the public office. The movement of women's suffrage was a struggle to address fundamental issues of justice and equality, and this lasted decades. The women of Canada, particularly Black Indigenous women of color, were met with a strong resistance as they fought and struggled for their own basic rights. Before the war, the women in countries such as Canada, the United States, and Great Britain were fighting a battle of their own. Despite the fact that the women in these countries were bound to their respective laws in their nations, they were denied the ability to speak up and change them. Those who supported the ideas of women's suffrage or the right to vote were known as suffragettes or suffragists, depending on the area and time. Person's case was a statutory ruling that initiated the right of women to be appointed into Senate. This movement was stated by the group of profound women's rights activists known as the Famous Five. The Supreme Court of Canada stated that according to the British North America Act, which is now called the Constitution Act of 1867, women were not considered to be persons. The Person's case allowed women to both work in the House of Commons and in the Senate, and this also meant women were no longer denied their basic rights. The Famous Five were a group of women's rights activists that made a huge impact when it came to the Person's case. The Famous Five were led by Judge Emily Murphy and included Henrietta Edwards, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, and Irene Parlby. At the time of their victory in 1929, they were known as the Alberta Five, but as the Person's case became a bigger aspect in Canadian history, they became well known as the Famous Five. The women of the Famous Five worked in various women's rights campaigns before they got together and before the Perkins case. Their work dated back to the 1880s and 1890s. Emily Murphy, born March 14, 1868, was a Canadian women's rights activist while traveling through the Alberta countryside. Emily met a woman whose husband left her, sold their farm, and gave the woman nothing to live off of. This encouraged Emily to start a campaign to protect women's property rights. In 1915, the Married Women's Home Protection Act was passed and was changed to the Dower Act in 1917. This meant that a wife had the right to a third of the share of her husband's property. Henrietta Edwards, born December 18, 1949, was known for being a women's rights activist and reformer. Henrietta fought for women's rights from a very young age. She helped create many organizations and campaigns, as well as being instrumental in the pass of the Dower Act in 1917. In 1878, Henrietta and her sister launched Women's Work in Canada. The publication only employed women and trained them to write the publication themselves. This magazine was considered to be the first Canadian magazine for working women. Nellie McClung, born October 20th, 1873, was an activist for women's rights as well as an author. Nellie played a huge role in the 1914 Liberal campaign against the Conservative government, which had refused women's suffrage. After moving to Edmonton, Nellie continued to fight for women's rights, later becoming one of the Famous Five. Louise McKinney, born September 22, 1868, was a women's rights activist. Louise was the first woman to be elected into the legislature in Canada and the British Empire. She was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, as well as a pioneer suffragist. She was criticized for her views on immigration, as people said that they were racist and elitist. Mary Irene Parlby, born January 9, 1868, was an advocate and activist for women's rights. She served as a member of the Legislative Assembly, or MLA, for 14 years and became the first Alberta woman and the second woman in all of the British Empire to be appointed for a cabinet position. Known as the Women's Minister, Irene's work was strictly dedicated to improving the life of women and girls all across Alberta as well as all of Canada. The end.
Hi, welcome to my section of the project. I'm doing this on the 1920s culture. So the dresses, what the women and men wore, what the mafia would look like, what the streets would look like, clubs, all the above, including music. So the 1920s was a decade that was remembered for all the fancy flapper girls, the colorful suits, the fedoras, the canes, the mafia, the hidden bars, all the secret stuff. And jazz. Jazz was popularized by a creator, or a massive person in jazz, named Louis Armstrong. And a lot of really popular songs from jazz, the jazz genre, were Sweet Georgia Brown, Diana, and Bye Bye Blackbird, which you can find all these songs now. But these songs, at the time in the 1920s, were played everywhere you looked. And the outfits, oh, don't get me started. The style, flapper girls, were women, they were kind of like early on street workers. Sorry, that's a bit dull. But they wore like the box dresses with the frills, the simple shapes. They were very loose and very sparkly and colorful, and lots of fun designs. But they were also kept quite simple. And these were the years that women were allowed to wear dresses that ended at their knees rather than their ankles. This was due to the fact that because of the wars that were going on at the moment, they needed to disperse the material used for certain dresses. And so they figured, why not just let them party for a decade? And then in the 1930s, they wore longer dresses again. They were more conservative. The men wore suits, so colorful suits. You'd find green suits, you'd find yellow suits, all of the above. There were lots of very fun colors. And the fedora was also very much popularized, even though it had attachments to the mafia and gang and gang bosses. It was crime related. And Canes were also popularized along with suspenders, and the canes were actually used as a display of currency, having money, being wealthy. And jazz was also introduced, another part of the culture. Jazz was popularized a lot by a guy named Louis Armstrong, and a lot of really famous jazz songs at the time were Sweet Georgia Brown, Diana, and Bye Bye Blackbird. And you can still find these songs; they're still very good songs. But those were the songs that you'd find in every bar. And speaking of bars, bars were hidden because Diana and Bye Bye Blackbird. And you can still find these songs; they're still very good songs. But those were the songs that you'd find in every bar. And speaking of bars, bars were hidden because of the alcohol prohibition. And so they had to hide them. And secret knocks would be used, and they would use like hidden bookcases. It was all very, very fascinating. If you look into it, it's really cool. And so I'm going to help you look into it. They were like massive bars that were popularized, and so basically you would have to know a guy to get into a bar. So there would be secret knock codes, which I already mentioned, and a lot of smuggling was also introduced, and that is how the mafia really thrived in those years. Because of all the alcohol that needed to get through, there was a lot of gang-related things going on with the alcohol, so you would need to smuggle it into a bar and not get caught, which was massive because they could only arrest you if they caught you in the act. Another thing is that crime was also very heightened in those years because of all the smuggling, along with illegal gambling, bars, which I already mentioned, and it was really cool. And so seeing all of this, and one thing I forgot to mention is that the women were actually allowed to wear suits, so they would wear suits as well. It became popular for women to dress more masculine. And yeah, it's pretty much it. It was a very, very cool era of fancy dresses. When you look back at the olden days, the 1920s were the years that were really remembered for all the flapper girls and the mafia, the Italian mob bosses. You know, when you look back at it, like The Godfather, you know, those movies, those are very influenced by the 1920s. And it was really just a year of throwing away cash because everyone had it and didn't know what to do with it. It was the decade of parties. It's a very beautiful history, and a lot of influences actually, or a lot of things that happened in the 1920s influenced what happened here and what's happening now. So a lot of the slang is used now. It's really, really cool. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
What happened when Robert Borden introduced conscription in World War I? When Prime Minister Robert Borden introduced conscription, the French Canadians revolted. Around a quarter of the eligible men for the draft lived in Quebec, but only around 11% were Quebec-born. The French rioted against conscription in Quebec City from March 30th to April 1st, 1918. The civilians raided hardware stores hoping to obtain firearms and other weapons. When the military came to suppress them, they fired on the military. The military fought back, killing 4 and injuring several more. What happened in politics during the Roaring Twenties? Arthur Meighen and William Lyon Mackenzie King controlled Canadian politics throughout the 20s, trading the role of Prime Minister back and forth. The 20s started with Arthur Meighen becoming Prime Minister for just over a year. During that time, he raised tariffs and fur rates, really not all that helpful. He was then succeeded by Liberal leader Mackenzie King, along with the help of the new political party, the Progressive Party. During 1926, a huge border scandal was uncovered, during which Mackenzie King was letting alcohol being transferred to the U.S., during which the U.S. was doing prohibition. Did the Great Depression affect politics? The stock market crashed on October 29, 1929, sending the Canadian economy and the rest of the world into the Great Depression. King lost the election in 1930 to the new Conservative leader R.B. Bennett. Bennett did not help anyone during the harshest stages of the Depression. He created unemployment work camps which didn't provide a large enough wage to support a family, although, on the contrary, he did create the Bank of Canada, the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Company, now CBC News, and he oversaw the signing of the Statute of Westminster. King won his third election in 1935 and stayed Prime Minister until 1948, becoming Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister of 22 years serving. King helped get Canada out of the Great Depression and made better relations with the US and Great Britain.